Hi. We are going to resume our small group discussions this week by discussing the book Reading the Bible with the Damned by Robert Ekblad. And as you read this book, you probably thought, boy, he's talking about the Bible in ways that are very different than I've ever heard of. Well, that's because he takes what is called a liberation theology approach to Scripture study. And in the PowerPoint that I've put up in the course documents section, I try to explain the difference. And And in my biblical thought for today, I want to try and illustrate how Ekblad might approach a particular scripture study. So instead of starting with a Bible passage like we often do in our scripture reflections and have been doing, Ekblad starts with a person's or a group's experience, usually an experience of struggle or suffering. So let me start with an experience that many people in our society have, as well as throughout the world. That is, living with HIV/AIDS. My wife is a social worker whose clients are all people who have been diagnosed as HIV positive, and many of whom are living with full blown AIDS. Now, when she started this work about 15 years ago, most of her clients died within 2 to 3 years, and many died within a year of her meeting them. But today, with access to proper medicines and ways of managing the disease, many people are living for much longer periods of time. Yet, even as they are living, people with AIDS still face a huge challenge because the medicines aren't cheap and one has to monitor themselves constantly. Your life becomes your disease. However, despite all these advances, there are still many stigmas attached to AIDS. People assume you're sexually promiscuous, that you're gay, that you're a drug user, all of which may be true. And so you're seen as some sort of pariah. I know in my last church that I pastored, I challenged the congregation in one particular sermon about being hospitable to people with AIDS, and I was met with strong resistance because people just felt like these were not the kind of people we wanted to associate with. And that's not just church folks. A lot of folks just kind of look at people with AIDS as people who are to be avoided, to be kept at arm's distance. They are stigmatized. So as a result, many people with AIDS hide their disease and live in fear of being found out because of this stigma. So what Bible story might speak to this particular passage? Well, one that comes to mind is found in Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 24. And in this story, Jesus is in the midst of a crowd, and a woman approaches him. Now, this woman has been living with a continuous flow of menstrual bleeding for 12 years, and no doctor that she has been to has been able to help her. And according to Jewish law in that society, she is a pariah, and she is what they call unclean, and therefore must live outside the city and stay away from other people, certainly stay away from crowds. And yet, in this story, she ventures not only into the city, but right into a crowd where Jesus is at the center. And as the story goes on, it says that she touches his cloak as he passes by. And Jesus stops, and he feels the power go out of him. He stops and he turns around and he asks, who touched me? And the disciples are kind of bewildered, like, Jesus, you're in a crowd. There's lots of people touching you. He says, no, someone touched me. I felt the power go out of me. And in fear of being condemned and being found out, this woman approaches and she confesses to Jesus that she is the one. And even as she had touched him, she had felt something begin to change in her body. And yet she knew that she was in the wrong for having come in and to the city and to the crowd and touched Jesus. Now, by law, Jesus should have condemned her for breaking all the social and religious codes. But instead, in verse 34 of chapter 5, Mark chapter 5, instead he says, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Now, what's interesting is that not only at that moment was the woman healed of her disease, but also she was healed of her stigma. She was allowed now to be in civil society. She was no longer considered unclean and no longer had to live outside the city bearing this terrible stigma of being an unclean person. Now, in discussing this passage, Ekblad might raise questions such as, what is it like to be continually sick? And what does that do to your self-esteem? I know for the past year I've been living with chronic asthma, and there are days when there's nothing more that I can do than just sort of try and get the next breath, and it really wears you down. And Ekblad might begin to ask people about their struggles with disease and with health problems. He might ask them, what is it like to feel and be considered unacceptable and unwanted in society? Many of the people he deals with are illegal immigrants or people who are either in prison or recently released from prison. And all such people carry huge stigmas. And so, what is it like to be a person who is unwanted and unacceptable? He might ask them what kind of strength and courage did it take for this woman to approach Jesus? And what is it like to continue on even in the face of rejection? He might also ask about the freedom. What was it like for her to be healed, and the freedom she felt when she healed? Not only healed of her disease, but healed of the stigma. And he might begin to talk with them about what are the stigmas we carry, and how can our relationship with God in Jesus help us to deal with those. He would ask folks to think about ways that they are excluded, and how even before this woman was physically healed, Jesus treated her as a worthy person, as a person with dignity and value. And the whole point of such a study would be to empower and to liberate folks, not only from their physical suffering, but also from the social stigmas that they live under. That they could be liberated to see themselves as whole persons and be liberated to give and serve others. You see, the Bible is a source of liberation for folks. Spiritual liberation, physical liberation, social and cultural liberation. And as we discuss this book, Reading the Bible with the Damned, I hope that we too can see how we have been liberated, and in turn can use our understanding of the Bible to bring liberation to others.